Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good night, good whatever it is where you're joining me for this. What I'm going to do is go through some bits and bobs for Sheila for your Inspector Calls assessment on Tuesday. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail about who she is and why she's important, etc. What I'm planning to do is just go through lots of quotes with you. And the reason I'm doing this is because you don't have a piece of text in front of you, do you, for this particular assessment? You've just got a question and no text. So it's really important that you know the text well, and you've got quite a few sort of like short, sharp quotes at your fingertips. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to discuss these quotes with you. Obviously, then what I'll do is share my homework, the actual PowerPoint, and then you've just got a PowerPoint with just lots of Sheila quotes on it that you can dip into and see which ones you think are important and useful. The choice will be yours. So just a very quick summary. Who is she? Well, she's in her early 20s, we're told in the opening stage directions. She's engaged to be married to Gerald Croft. She's the daughter of Arthur Burling and Sybil Burling and the sister of Eric. The Burlings being an upper-class family of 1912. At first, J.B. Priestley describes her as being a bit giddy, naive and very definitely childish, and we'll look at some quotes to support that. The stage directions say a pretty girl in her early 20s, very pleased with life and rather excited. The very pleased with life might suggest to us that she's a bit smug, mightn't it really? She's definitely very pleased with herself because she's made a very good engagement with Gerald. And this is precisely how she comes across in the first act of the play. In the second and the third acts, following the realisation that she's played a part in Eva Smith's death, she matures and comes to realise the importance of the inspector's message. And that's kind of our big idea, isn't it, for this question? The question's asking you to look at how she's learned lessons about herself and about society. So that's our big idea, isn't it? That she started off as one type of person, a bit materialistic, definitely childish, immature. I don't think she was actually that confident. The inspector arrives, he shares his message with her, she takes on board that message, and as the play progresses, she changes massively, doesn't she? She learns her lesson, she takes responsibility, and she changes. That's a key thing about Sheila, isn't it? She changes. She also tries to encourage the members of her family to do the same, doesn't she? Sheila Burling, along with her generation being the younger generation, she's the open to changing attitudes on society and wealth. She represents with Eric the younger generation. Priestley saw them as more impressionable, and after all, they were the future. And she gives the audience hope that their society can improve if people make changes, and this is the key message, take responsibility. If somebody like Sheila can change, the message is from the playwright, from Priestley, if somebody like Sheila can change, and she's been born into that upper class world, her childhood, the way she's been treated, the way she's been taught to think, would have very deep set ideas about the working class and how they should be treated. If Sheila can change, then anyone can. And she really is a message of hope, isn't she? Right. Now, what I've done is just written down lots of quotes. I'm going to talk about those quotes with you and explain how you could use them in an essay. Some of the quotes are sort of like saying they're very much the same thing. So sorry if it's a bit repetitive sometimes. And of course, please bear in mind that you couldn't possibly use all of these quotes in one essay. I've just put down as many as I could think of. You dip in and you choose some and you leave others, but you make the decision about which ones are the best ones to support the point that you are making, okay? So please don't be overwhelmed, and please don't sit down and try and learn all of these. You can't possibly, and you're not expected to. I'm just giving you a wide choice, that is all. Okay, so we talked about the stage directions, didn't we, on the previous slide, about how she's in her early 20s, she's rather pleased with life and rather excited about her engagement. One of the first things we hear her say to Gerald is, yes, except for all last summer, when you never came near me and I wondered what had happened to you. Now, I think we've got a little bit of foreshadowing there, because as we know, this is all explained later by his relationship with Daisy Renton, Eva Smith. And I also think we've got a reason perhaps why she would have a lack of confidence, okay? She knows that something's happened there. Does she question it with him? She mentions it, but does she dig deep down and say, oh, where were you? Why didn't I see you? She just kind of accepts it. And Mrs. Burling says the same thing. So this is kind of like telling us a bit about what life was like for women at the time. But her mother supports it and says, oh, Sheila, well, sometimes men are very busy at work. And when I married your father, I just had to accept that. So what Mrs. Burling and what this incident is telling us there is that, women of 1912 just had to accept their role in society and sort of do pretty much what the males in either the family or the male she was married to do as you're told. Okay. Neither do I. I can't really remember that one. Cross that one out. I can't remember that. Page 5. We've got sexism or the view of women. Okay. Excited. Oh, Gerald, you've got it. Is it the one you wanted me to have? Okay. Now she's got the ring. And she says, is it the one you wanted me to have? So can you see that, again, just there, we've got a lack of control. She hasn't had anything to do with the buying of this engagement ring. It's all been Gerald's choice. And she seems to just accept it, doesn't she? And then we see another side of her here. Oh, it's wonderful. Look, mummy, isn't it a beauty? Oh, darling. And she kisses Gerald hastily. Now, this would suggest perhaps that she's a bit materialistic, okay? Because she's very interested, isn't she, in the ring and having of the ring. Mummy, I think it's the first time she uses that word, and the word mummy is childish and immature. This is a woman in her early 20s that's about to get married, and she still calls her parents mummy and daddy. Now, this was very typical of the upper classes, and it still is typical of the upper classes, who call their parents mummy and daddy through all of their lives. I just listened to a radio interview a couple of days ago with a woman who's in her 80s, but she's an upper class woman, and she described her mother as mummy. So it happens, but there's no doubt that it does make Sheila sound rather childish, doesn't it? When she talks about the ring as well, she also says, oh, now I feel really engaged. Okay, so she needed the symbol of the ring to feel like that, didn't she? It's the materialistic object that made her feel engaged. And she also says that she's never going to let it out of her sight. Oh, how ironic is that? Because then later on, of course, we know that she very symbolically gives back that ring, doesn't she? On page 6, I'm sorry, Daddy, actually, I was listening. Again, it's just immature, isn't it? And, oh, sorry, I didn't know. Mummy sent me in to ask you why you didn't come along. And that's, when the inspectors arrived and she's come in to say, why haven't you come and joined us? Notice how at the end of the meal, the women left the room and went somewhere else. The gentlemen stayed and drank port and smoked cigars and talked about manly things like war and business behind, with the ladies not there. And Eric says, they're probably going to go off and talk about dresses. And Mr. Burling chips in with, well, yes, you've got to understand that that kind of thing is very important to women. It's how they judge their self-worth, which absolutely tells us how women were viewed by this upper class society at that time. Clearly inferior and not having any great role to play when the most important thing they've got to think about is a dress. And both Eric and Gerald and Mr. Burling all kind of contributing to that. She then says, well, what's all this about? So she's curious, isn't she, to find out what's going on. And she is the only one that reacts, and Eva later, but actually reacts about Eva's death. Oh, how horrible, she says. Was it an accident? And then, of course, the inspector goes on to sort of explain what's happened. But she's the only one that kind of goes, oh my God, that's dreadful. So maybe very early on we can see, can't we, that there's something a little bit more to Sheila. And maybe she does have that capacity to change. However, she then ruins it a bit with this, and she says, and I've been so happy tonight. Oh, I wish you hadn't told me. And somehow she manages to bring the death of this girl back to herself and how she feels, doesn't she? So, oh yes, it's horrible, but I wish you hadn't told me I was having such a lovely evening. Which again, I think shows us, when I teach, I like to use the word shallow to describe Sheila, because everything she's interested in is very on the surface, isn't it? There's no depth to her character. She doesn't think deeply, does she? So there's no depth to her character, if you can see what I mean by that. And it's all about her there, isn't it? And then I've got this quote from Mr. Burling, who says to her about when the inspector's going to talk to him, nothing to do with you, Sheila, run along. Oh my gosh, you would not say that to a fully grown woman, run along. So Mr. Burling is clearly treating her like a child, and the language that he uses makes her sound like a child. Run along. It's got nothing to do with you. You'd only say that to a child, wouldn't you? Now, this is important. When she hears that the girl has died, one of her first questions to the inspector about the girl was, pretty, she says. She's saying, was she pretty? Well, that's very shallow, and it shows us that Sheila is only really she's very interested in what things look like, because at that time women would have been judged on their appearance, and Sheila is just kind of conforming to that, isn't she? But it seems, if you'd just been told that someone had committed suicide in a horrible way, I honestly don't think anybody would ever come up with, oh, was she pretty? It's such a shallow question, isn't it? And it's so unimportant to what's happened as well. So I think it tells us a lot about her. But she then goes on to say, when she finds out about what her father did to Eva, she says, I think it was a mean thing to do, and it's a rotten shame. So we know that she is capable of change. We know she's not a bad person, because right at the very beginning she says these things that make us think, oh, maybe there is a bit more to her than we can see at the present moment. And then she says this, which I think is one of her, possibly her most important quotes, is this one. Her father described his labour force as cheap labour, where he completely sort of like dehumanised them. And she responds with, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. So right at the very beginning, she can see, can't she, that there's more to this, and that actually we can't just lump the working class together and call them cheap labour, that we've got to look at them as individual human beings, unlike her father and the upper classes. There's a little talk about Millward's, the shop, and she says, oh, I was there this afternoon for your benefit. Again, you know, she was out shopping, she just materialistic and interested in gifts, doesn't she? Then when he talks to her, she gives a little cry. When I say him, I mean the inspector, sorry, and a half-stifled sob. Instantly, she knows she's done wrong, okay? She knows she's done wrong. And straight away, she's upset, isn't she? Okay. She says to the inspector, "You knew it was me all the time, didn't you?" Now, I've got a few examples of this where we've got Sheila being, I'm running out of space, the word is perceptive. She is the only member of the family, and with Gerald as well, that actually realises quite quickly what's going on with the inspector. So when she makes that comment, she's saying, "I'm fully aware that you knew, before you came here, you knew it was me that had her sacked from Millwoods." And, you know, this tells us there's a lot more to her as a character. She's perceptive, she sees things, she's intelligent as well. And obviously women at that time weren't sort of like encouraged to be intelligent. Their education was enough to make them a good marriage prospect and nothing else. Women didn't train to be doctors, to be scientists, to be, you know, chemists, to anything like that. They simply were educated enough so that they could hold a decent conversation, do a nice bit of sewing, and be a good wife to someone. Then here, miserably, she's unhappy. "So I'm really responsible." She's the first person in the play that uses this word, responsible. And we know that this is the key word in the whole play, isn't it? Responsible, responsibility, social responsibility. And she accepts it straight away. There's a question mark, she's questioning, but she's used that word, responsible. The inspector says, "Partly responsible," doesn't he? "It's not just you," but she has accepted her responsibility. She then goes on to try and explain the incident that had happened at Millwoods. "I'd been in a bad temper anyhow," she says, which makes her sound, gosh, quite unpleasant at that point. And I think the key word, she sounds selfish. I was in a bad mood, so I was going to take it out on someone else. She says as well to the inspector, Gerald tries to kind of like absolve her a little bit, and she says, "No, not really. It was my fault." She fully accepts it. She takes the blame, doesn't she? Okay. And then she says, "All right, Gerald, you needn't look at me like that. At least I'm trying to tell the truth. I expect you've done things that you're ashamed of too." Now, by saying that to him, it tells us that she's ashamed of her actions, isn't she? She feels ashamed of what she did. She knew that having Eva Smith sacked in that way was a dreadful thing to do, but she takes responsibility, ashamed of it. Still in Act 1 here, "No, not really, it was my fault." I think I've just said that one, sorry, I've repeated it. "So I'm really responsible." And then she explains the incident. She says, "I couldn't be sorry for her. She was a very pretty girl." And it completely shows us that she judged Eva on her appearance. If she hadn't been pretty, it wouldn't have happened. She's as much as admitting that. It was because she was pretty that she took against her and she was angry. And then she does this. "I told him that if they didn't get rid of that girl, I'd never go near the place again. And I'd persuade Mother to close our account with them." Now, this is a vindictive and spiteful act, isn't it? Okay, it's all about getting her own back. She did not know the consequences of her actions, but she didn't think about the consequences of her actions. She didn't think about what would happen to Eva when she'd lost her job. How could she possibly know what would happen? She wouldn't know because she doesn't have any interaction with the working class, does she? I was absolutely furious. I was very rude to both of them. So it wasn't just Eva that she was rude to. She was rude to the other sales lady as well. So this makes her sound sort of like very upper class and unpleasant, doesn't it? That she feels, I think the other sales assistant was probably older than her, but because of her class, she feels that she can speak to people who work in shops in that way, that she can be rude to them because of her class. She also says, "I'll never, never do it again." She repeats the word never to emphasise that she absolutely has learned her lesson and she won't. And if I could help her now, I would, but it's too late, isn't it? Okay, but she accepts what she's done and she understands. The inspector said to her, so you used the power you had to punish her. And I think his words are exactly what she did. And the power that she had, let's not forget, is because she was upper class and because Eva was working class. That's why she had the power, and she used her power, she abused her power, and she punished Eva for something that she's not even 100% sure that she did. It was just a look, wasn't it? That's all she was guilty of. And then she speaks to Gerald like this. Why? Why? You fool. He knows, of course he knows. And I hate to think how much he knows that we don't know yet. You'll see. You'll see. Right, there's lots of repetition here, isn't there? Okay. Once again, the repetition is sort of like emphasizing her point. Once again, she's showing us that she understands about the inspector, okay, that she knows he knows and she can see what's going on there. And she's just called her fiance, a man, a fool, okay? You fool, she says to Gerald. Right, she certainly wouldn't have spoken to him like that. My F looks a little weird. She certainly wouldn't have spoken to him like, again. She certainly wouldn't have spoken to him like that at the beginning of the play, would she? She wouldn't have had the confidence. And, you know, she is younger than Gerald as well. And class-wise, he is her social superior. But just as a man, he is her superior. So for her to call him a fool is very out of kind of like character. But I think it shows us her growing confidence, doesn't it? Her self-assuredness, that she's more sure of herself at this point, isn't she? Right, this next quote, only a little one. Then I'm staying. Okay, this is Sheila. She asserts her authority. Okay, Gerald desperately wants her to go away. Okay, he doesn't want her to stay and listen to the story that he's going to tell the inspector. She puts her foot down and says, I'm staying. Okay, I'm not going anywhere, I'm staying. She wants to stay and listen to what he's got to say. Of course she does. She has a perfect right to do that, but Gerald doesn't want her to. Gerald speaks for her and says she's had a long, exciting and tiring day. Oh my gosh, she sounds like a small child. So he speaks for her. Does she say, I'm tired, I've had an exciting day, and it's been very long? No, he speaks for her because he's a man. He feels that he can do that. And he also treats her like a child. There are so many examples of this. Mr. and Mrs. Burling do it as well. So she then says to Gerald when he says, oh, okay, you're happy now that I'm in trouble as well. So that's what you think I'm really like. I just think the whole tone of the way she speaks to him has changed. She's willing to challenge him now and speak to him. And it was, oh, Gerald, darling, at the beginning, wasn't it? It was very, very different. But now she's called him a fool and she says, you know, that's what you think I'm really like. And I think there's certain sort of like, you know, authority in her tone. And she's deeply disappointed in him as well. She's the first to accept responsibility, take the blame. Again, this is her saying, I know I'm to blame and I'm desperately sorry. That quote's very similar to the quotes on the previous pages. It's perfectly okay if you get them muddled up. But as long as you've got some kind of quote where she says, you know, I'm desperately sorry, I know I'm to blame, so it was my responsibility. They're all very similar. And I think Prissy probably has her saying this several times to show the audience just how genuine she is, that she actually really means this. She then says to the inspector, there's something I don't understand about you. Now, again, this is an example of her being sort of perceptive and intelligent, she knows. She doesn't know what she knows because we never find out who he is or where he's come from. It doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't matter who he is or what he's come from, because Priestley has purely used the inspector to get his point of view across about social responsibility. But she knows there's something not quite right about this. But she knows he knows. But even though she knows it's not right, she doesn't challenge it, does she? She doesn't say, oh, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Not like Gerald did at the end. And she says this: you mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl. If you do, then the inspector will just break it down, and it'll be all the worse when he does. Again, it's this perceptive intelligence, isn't it? She understands what her parents don't. And then this line as well: he's giving us the rope so that we'll hang ourselves. Now, I think the word hang there is very interesting, isn't it? It is a phrase that's used. If you give someone enough rope, they'll hang themselves. It kind of means they'll get themselves into trouble. But I wonder about this word hang and this metaphor. Is this suggesting to us that she feels that they murdered Eva? Because the whole play is like a murder mystery, isn't it? But there is no one's been murdered. It's a suicide that's taken place. But I think the metaphor that she uses there, sort of, I think she's clearly telling us that maybe she feels that they're guilty of some sort of crime, because nobody's committed a crime apart from Eric, who we have at the end, who's stolen money. Of course, he forced himself upon Eva as well, but at that time, an upper-class man doing that to a working-class girl, there would have been no repercussions for what he did. But he did steal. But, you know, she hasn't committed a crime. Her mother hasn't, her father hasn't, Gerald hasn't. But does she feel that they have acted in this way? So I think rope and hanging are interesting words in that metaphor that you could dig down deep into and sort of try and work out why she uses, or why Priestley makes her use that particular metaphor. Then I'm saying, that's what I really like. Right, I know I'm to blame. Okay, sorry, I've already done those ones. I need to work some more work on my PowerPoint. Sorry, guys. So just ignore those. We've just looked at them. But Mrs. Burling says, and please be quiet, Sheila. Like a child. And she's showing us that they don't think that Sheila should have a voice. Okay, so think about what the Burlings do all the time. Mr. and Mrs. Burling, they try to protect her, and they don't want her involved. They don't want her listening to the kind of things that young ladies shouldn't listen to. Certainly Gerald's story would be very shocking, wouldn't it, to a young woman like Sheila? But she doesn't feel she should be allowed to have a voice. Be quiet, Sheila, she instructs her, doesn't she? And then she turns to her husband and says, what's the matter with that child? Okay, now two things there. She addresses the comments to Mr. Burling, so she doesn't even speak directly to Sheila, and she's calling this 20-something-year-old woman who's just got married a child. Once again, they, this is a word you can use, they infantilize Sheila. And all that means is that they make her like a child. They turn her into an infant, the way they speak to her and about her. Okay. To her mother, she says, Mrs. Burling is very shocked when the inspector tells her that Gerald has had an affair, and she just turns around and says, of course, mother, it was obvious from the start. Notice the way that she's changed the way she speaks to her mother. Her tone is different and it's more authoritative. Can you see? It's different, isn't it? Somebody said something about the inspector, and she cuts in, she interrupts. That's very confident, isn't it? And she says, I know, somehow he makes you, that's the inspector, he makes you talk. And once again, we have the impression that she sort of understands the inspector and what he's doing, that she's way more on top of things. She's way more perceptive than the other characters. And she says she might as well admit to it as well. Now, when she hears her mother's story, she says this, mother. Oh, mother twice, sorry there. What's she not calling her now? No more mummy. Okay, twice she's called her, 3 times, mother. It's more mature. It's more mature, but it's not as affectionate as mummy, is it? Okay. There's something about mummy that's got a lot of affection kind of associated with it, I think. It's a very familiar kind of loving word, isn't it? Mother is way more formal, and it just doesn't have the loving connotations that the word mummy does. Mother, I think that was cruel and vile. So those are the adjectives, those are the words that she chooses to describe her mother's act of not giving any money, any charity to Eva Smith when she was a pregnant woman with no job and no means of supporting herself. And Mrs. Burling just cuts her off with nothing. Cruel and vile. So those are, a couple of words that you could look at, and the connotations of cruel, that she's acted without any, she's had no sympathy, no mercy, no pity for this poor girl. And Sheila can see that, and she says it as well. Then when her mother is going to drop Eric right in it by going, oh, it's the father, he's responsible, you should look for the father. Stop, she says. She realises once again, she can see, she's thinking, oh my God, it's Eric, isn't it? Eric's the father. Again, she's more perceptive than the other characters, isn't she? And then interestingly, when Gerald had told his story, she says, I rather respect you more than I've ever done before, which I think is such a mature comment. Okay, there's no screaming, no crying, no elaborate sorrow, which as a woman, an upper class woman, she would have been raised not to show great bursts of emotion in public anyway. But I think the self-control, when she's just heard that terrible story about what her fiance was up to, and it is a shocking story, and she would be deeply upset about what happened with Eva Smith, but she has the self-control and the maturity to say, actually, I respect you. I respect the fact that you've told the story and that you've been honest. So I think that's a massive change in Sheila. And I rather have some respect for her as a character that she would say something like that. Act 3. Right, this is where she really comes into her own, isn't it? She now starts to talk like the inspector, because he's not there for the whole of Act 3. He leaves them, doesn't he? And we can call it that she becomes the inspector's mouthpiece. Okay, so when he's gone, she asks the kind of questions that he would have asked if he'd been there. And this is truly symbolic, isn't it, of her change. Page 56, she's crying quietly. That's the worst of it. This is kind of like real emotion. Okay, I don't think we ever as an audience think that Sheila is putting this on to please the inspector. I think as an audience, we're aware from the start that this is very real, isn't it? Then this one here, between us, we drove that girl to commit suicide. We drove that girl. So again, we've got this full responsibility, but she's saying it was all of us that did that. And we kind of like, she's saying they left her no choice. Where could Eva Smith go? She had nowhere else to go, and she took her life. Don't you see, if it's all that's come out tonight is true, that it doesn't matter who it was who made us confess. I think that word confess is really telling, because you know a confession is when you confess a sin, okay? So it's got kind of almost sort of biblical connotations there, hasn't it? But the word confess is biblical, and it makes us feel that Sheila thinks she's committed a sin. And it was true, wasn't it? You turned the girl out of one job, I had her turned out of another. Gerald kept her at a time when he was supposed to be too busy to see me. Eric, well, we know what Eric did. And Mother hardened her heart and gave her the final push that finished her. That's what's important, and not whether the man is a police inspector or not. Oh, Sheila, she's a star, isn't she? I've seen some people calling her an actual role model for the audience. But look at what she's saying there. She's saying it doesn't matter. He could have been a hoax. He could have been anything. But we all did what we did. I don't care who he was, she's saying. I don't care if he was real or not. We all did those things, and they were terrible, terrible things. And that won't bring Eva Smith back to life, will it? Okay, asking questions. Absolutely, it doesn't matter what they think, does it? There's still a dead girl, okay? She's the only one that can see. You're forgetting one thing I still can't forget, says Sheila. Everything we said had happened, really had happened. If it didn't end tragically, then that's lucky for us, but it might have done. Now that's when they have this glimmer of hope, when they've rung the infirmary and they've said, oh, there's no girls in that committed suicide. Okay, she says, well, okay, if she didn't commit suicide, but it might have done, she says. She is, I think she's angry with her parents. I think she's ashamed of her parents because they don't get it. They still behaved the way that they did. And of course, we know that the play ends with, oh, well, actually, there is a dead girl after all. But it might have done, and that's enough to be sorry about, she says. And then her other quote here, she says, no, because I remember what he said, he is the inspector, how he looked and what he made me feel. Fire and blood and anguish. And it frightens me the way you talk. Now, she mirrors and repeats the inspector's language there, doesn't she? She uses those same words, those same fire, blood, biblical type words, anguish, extreme misery. I tell you, whoever that inspector was, it was anything but a joke, because her father says, oh, someone's playing a joke on us. All right, again, we know that she's taking this very seriously. And we have a huge change in character compared to previous quotes. Remember that she gave the ring back to Eric. Now, Gerald, her brother, scratch that idea. She gave the ring back to Gerald. We must understand what an incredibly mature thing that was to do. This is a woman who's been raised all her life to know that she's only really going to do one thing in her life, and that is to get married and have children. That's what she's been raised to do, to become a good wife and a good mother. The fact that she gives that ring back to Gerald is huge, because he was everything she could have ever wished for. He's high class. One day she would have become Lady Croft herself, and she's done well to get this engagement, but she gives it back. Well done. How strong is Sheila to do that? And then at the end, he says, oh, come on, he tries to give her the ring back like nothing's happened. She doesn't take that ring, and she says, I must think. Oh, this is a very in control Sheila, isn't it, here, that Priestley presents us with. She's not just going to take that ring, she's got to think about everything that's happened. And what an intelligent type of comment as well, isn't it, that she's got to say for herself there. A very, very different Sheila at the end. Now, I'm not saying that that's everything, all of the quotes. But I've had a bit of a kind of like a run through them there, and I think there's some good ones. So I'm going to share it with you just as a PowerPoint. I need to tidy it up a bit because I had a bit of repetition as well there, didn't I? So make sure I get rid of the bits that I've repeated. And what this obviously is on the YouTube channel that you're watching, but I'll put the PowerPoint without the audio on to show my homework. Best of luck. I hope you've all had a really nice Eid and you've had a bit of a break. Remember when you do your essay to start it off with your big idea. What are you saying about Sheila? What are you saying about what she's learned? How has she changed? What's different about her? And then try as well to back up your ideas where you can. And there's not many language techniques, are there? And it's not like Shakespeare, is it, this play, because it's a modern play. But think about the stage directions, and remember, stage direction is a technique. Look at the repetition that we've seen here, and really think about how she's a typical woman of her class, but how she changes and accepts responsibility, and she changes as a person, doesn't she, as well as her social conscience is developed. She didn't have a social conscience before, and now she's got one. But it's not just that. She's really matured and become more confident and self-assured as a woman as well. At a time when women probably weren't confident and self-assured because they were treated as inferiors. Right, guys, I hope that's helped in some small way. I think you all know my email. If anyone needs to ask a question, I'll endeavour to get straight back to you as quickly as I possibly can. But for now, thank you very much indeed for listening, and good luck on Tuesday with this one. Bye.